My name is Vanessa Gardner. I'm 35 years old, and as I stood at Gate 47 preparing to board the flight to Hawaii that I had secretly funded for my entire family by working overtime for 4 months and spending $14,000 of my savings, my sister Rachel slapped me hard across the face in front of dozens of boarding passengers, and my parents Frank and Carol immediately told me to stop making a scene without defending me or acknowledging that I had just been physically assaulted. What my family didn't know was that the vacation they were seconds away from boarding was paid for entirely by the person they had just blamed for being assaulted, and that the airline app on my phone would allow me to cancel their tickets before they could step onto the plane. I've spent the last 12 years building a successful career as a medical device sales representative, working with hospitals and surgical centers throughout the Pacific Northwest to provide the specialized equipment that makes complex procedures possible. My job requires extensive product knowledge, relationship building with medical professionals, and the ability to be on call for emergency equipment needs at irregular hours. But the compensation reflects those demands, with my annual income reaching approximately $160,000 through base salary plus commissions. The Hawaii vacation had been my idea and my financial undertaking from the beginning, though I had deliberately kept the funding details vague when discussing the trip with my family. I had suggested the vacation during a family dinner 6 months earlier, mentioning that it would be wonderful to spend a week together in Maui at a beachfront resort, where we could relax, reconnect, and create positive memories away from the stresses of our daily lives. "That sounds lovely," Carol had said when I first proposed the idea, "but vacations are so expensive, especially to Hawaii. I don't know if we could afford something like that right now." I had responded with deliberate ambiguity. "I've been looking at options and I think we can make it work if everyone contributes what they can. Let me handle the research and booking, and we'll figure out the financial details as we get closer to the trip." The phrasing had been carefully constructed to suggest collective financial responsibility, while actually leaving me free to fund the entire vacation without my family understanding the full extent of my contribution. I had learned over years of family dynamics that being transparently generous with Frank, Carol, and Rachel only resulted in that generosity being taken for granted or treated as expected rather than appreciated. The $14,000 total cost included round-trip airfare for 4 people at $750 per person, a week-long stay at a 4-star beachfront resort with 2 ocean view rooms at $400 per night, a rental car for transportation around the island, and a budget for activities like snorkeling excursions, a sunset dinner cruise, and visits to various attractions throughout Maui. I had paid for everything up front using my credit card, accumulated the points and miles from the purchases, and structured the booking so that I maintained control over all reservations and confirmations. Working overtime to afford the vacation had meant accepting additional territories when colleagues went on leave, taking emergency on-call shifts that paid premium rates, and sacrificing weekends and evenings for 4 months to maximize my commission earnings. The sacrifice had been substantial, requiring me to postpone personal financial goals and delay my own apartment upgrade, but I had convinced myself that creating positive family memories and demonstrating generosity toward my parents and sister would somehow improve our strained relationships. But family dynamics don't improve simply because you spend money on shared experiences. And the patterns that had characterized my relationship with Rachel throughout our lives were about to manifest in the most public and devastating way possible at an airport gate in front of dozens of witnesses. Rachel had always been the volatile, unpredictable sibling whose emotional outbursts and occasional physical aggression were excused by our parents as evidence of her passionate nature or emotional sensitivity. Throughout our childhood and into our adult years, Rachel's tantrums, angry explosions, and periodic physical attacks on me had been normalized by Frank and Carol, who consistently reframed her violence as something I needed to tolerate to maintain family harmony. "You know how Rachel gets when she's upset," Carol would say after Rachel had screamed at me or pushed me during family gatherings. "She's more emotional than you are, and she doesn't handle stress well. You need to be the bigger person and not provoke her when she's in a bad mood." The characterization of Rachel's violence as something I was provoking by my mere presence or normal behavior had been a constant theme throughout our lives. If Rachel hit me because I had taken a toy she wanted when we were children, I was told I should have known better than to play with something she might want. If Rachel screamed at me for perceived slights during family dinners as adults, I was told I should be more careful about what I said around her. The pattern had created a family dynamic where I was expected to constantly monitor Rachel's emotional state, adjust my behavior to avoid triggering her anger, and accept whatever verbal or physical abuse she directed at me, because holding her accountable would cause family conflict that Frank and Carol desperately wanted to avoid. Have you ever realized that your family has spent your entire life training you to accept abuse, to make their lives easier? That's exactly what I understood about my relationship with Frank, Carol, and Rachel. They had built a system where I was responsible for preventing Rachel's violence by managing her emotions, and when prevention failed, I was responsible for minimizing the consequences by not making a scene about being abused. The financial dimension of my family relationships had followed a similar pattern of expectation without reciprocity. Since establishing my career and achieving financial stability, I had gradually become the family member who funded gatherings, covered unexpected expenses, and ensured that Frank and Carol could maintain their lifestyle despite modest retirement income that didn't quite cover the standard of living they wanted to maintain. I paid for family dinners at restaurants, bought plane tickets when Frank and Carol wanted to visit relatives, covered car repairs when their vehicles needed maintenance they couldn't afford, and generally served as a financial safety net that was taken completely for granted. Rachel, who worked sporadically in retail positions and frequently quit jobs after conflicts with managers or coworkers, contributed nothing financially to family expenses, but felt entitled to benefit from everything I funded. "Vanessa can afford it," Rachel would say dismissively when anyone suggested she should contribute to costs. "She makes all that money in medical sales. It's not fair to expect me to pay the same amount when I barely make minimum wage." The fact that her minimal wage reflected her refusal to maintain steady employment or pursue career development was never acknowledged as relevant to these financial discussions. The Hawaii vacation represented the culmination of this dynamic. I had worked extensive overtime to fund an expensive trip for people who would assume my contribution was expected rather than generous, and who would likely make the entire week about managing Rachel's moods and ensuring she didn't have outbursts that would ruin the vacation for everyone. But the vacation would never happen, because Rachel's violence and our parents' enabling of it was about to collide with my growing awareness that I no longer needed to accept abuse from people I was actively supporting financially and emotionally. The morning of our Hawaii trip had started with typical family chaos and inefficiency that immediately tested my patience. I had arranged for an early afternoon flight that would arrive in Maui with enough daylight remaining to check into the resort and perhaps walk on the beach before dinner. But coordinating 4 adults who had different ideas about timing and preparation proved predictably difficult. I had offered to drive everyone to the airport in my SUV, which could comfortably accommodate 4 passengers and all our luggage. But Frank had insisted on driving separately because he didn't want to feel rushed by my schedule. This decision meant we took 2 vehicles and had to coordinate meeting at the airport, adding unnecessary complexity to what should have been a straightforward departure. We met at the terminal entrance as planned, and I helped unload luggage while Frank parked his car in long-term parking. The atmosphere was already tense, with Rachel complaining about having to wake up early for the flight, and Carol fussing about whether she had packed everything she needed despite having had months to prepare for the trip. The check-in and security process proceeded normally, though Rachel made several comments about the inconvenience of airport procedures and the incompetence of TSA agents who were taking forever to screen passengers. I had learned to ignore these complaints as background noise. Rachel's default mode was dissatisfaction with her surroundings, and attempting to address or challenge her negativity only escalated her mood. We arrived at Gate 47 approximately 45 minutes before our scheduled departure time, settling into seats in the waiting area while I monitored the flight status and boarding announcements. The gate area was crowded with other Hawaii-bound passengers, many of whom were families with children or couples clearly excited about their vacation plans. "I'm going to get coffee," Rachel announced about 30 minutes before boarding, standing up and looking at me expectantly as though I was supposed to volunteer to get it for her or offer money to purchase it. "Okay," I said neutrally. not offering either to accompany her or to fund her coffee purchase. The small assertion of boundaries, simply acknowledging her statement without automatically volunteering to serve her needs, was a deliberate choice, reflecting my growing frustration with the dynamic where I was expected to anticipate and fulfill Rachel's wants without her ever expressing appreciation or reciprocity. "Aren't you going to come with me?" Rachel asked, her voice carrying an edge of irritation that signaled I had failed to perform according to her expectations. "I want to stay here in case they make any boarding announcements," I said, keeping my voice calm and reasonable. "You can get your coffee and come back before we board." The exchange was completely innocuous, a simple decision to remain at the gate rather than accompany my adult sister to purchase coffee. But I could see Rachel's expression shifting into the familiar pattern of offense and anger that preceded her outbursts. In her worldview, my failure to immediately accommodate her implied request was a deliberate slight that warranted emotional response. "Fine," Rachel said sharply, and walked toward the coffee stand without another word. Carol gave me a look that suggested I had somehow failed in my sisterly duties by not eagerly volunteering to accompany Rachel. But she said nothing as I remained seated and continued checking my phone. Rachel returned about 10 minutes later carrying a large coffee and appearing even more irritated than when she had left. "The line was ridiculous," she complained to no one in particular, "and they got my order wrong. But by the time I noticed, I was already back here, and I'm not going back to deal with their incompetence." I made a neutral sound of acknowledgement without engaging with her complaints about the coffee service, recognizing that anything I said would either be wrong or would be interpreted as taking the barista's side against her. The safest response to Rachel's complaints was minimal engagement that acknowledged she had spoken without committing to any position that she might use as ammunition for argument. The boarding announcement came about 5 minutes later. "We'd like to welcome our first-class passengers and our premium members for early boarding of Flight 247 to Maui." The gate agent's voice was professional and clear, and I watched as the first group of passengers began lining up at the boarding door. Our seats were in the main cabin, which meant we would board in one of the later groups, but I gathered my belongings and prepared for boarding anyway, ensuring my boarding pass was accessible, and my carry-on bag was ready to go when our group was called. "We're not boarding yet," Rachel said, noticing my preparations. "Why are you standing up already? They haven't even called our group." "I'm just getting ready so we can board efficiently when they call us," I explained, my voice still calm and neutral despite growing tension about Rachel's critical attention to my normal pre-boarding activities. "You always do this," Rachel continued, her voice rising with inexplicable anger. "You rush everything and make everyone else feel like they're being slow. We have plenty of time before they call our group. Sit down and relax instead of making everyone anxious with your rushing." The accusation that my normal preparation for boarding was somehow making everyone anxious was absurd, but I recognized the pattern. Rachel was working herself into an emotional state over something completely mundane, and attempting to logic her out of that state would only escalate her anger. "I'm just getting ready to board," I said simply, remaining standing with my bag and refusing to let her criticism change my behavior. "You can get ready whenever you want to." The refusal to immediately comply with her demand that I sit down triggered something in Rachel that I had seen countless times throughout our lives. The shift from irritation to rage that preceded her most volatile outbursts. Her face flushed, her jaw tightened, and I could see her body language changing into aggressive posture that signaled imminent explosion. "You think you're so much better than everyone else," Rachel said, her voice loud enough now that nearby passengers were beginning to turn and look at us. "Standing there with your perfect organization and your rushing, making everyone else feel inadequate because we're not performing to your standards." The characterization of my standing and preparing to board as somehow making her feel inadequate revealed the depth of Rachel's insecurity and her tendency to interpret other people's normal behavior as judgments of her own deficiencies. But I had no opportunity to respond or de-escalate, because what happened next occurred so quickly that I barely registered it before feeling the impact. Rachel stepped forward and slapped me hard across my left cheek, the sound of the impact echoing in the gate area and causing heads to turn throughout the crowded space. The physical shock of being hit was accompanied by the surreal awareness that my sister had just committed assault in front of dozens of witnesses at an airport gate, minutes before we were supposed to board a vacation together. The slap stung intensely, and I felt my eyes water from the impact and the shock of the attack. I stood frozen, holding my boarding pass and carry-on bag, while passengers around us stared at the scene Rachel had created through her violence. The moment that followed would define our family dynamic and my response to it forever. The immediate aftermath of being slapped at the airport gate should have resulted in my parents defending me, condemning Rachel's violence, or at minimum acknowledging that assault was unacceptable regardless of whatever perceived provocation Rachel claimed had justified her attack. But Frank and Carol's response revealed everything I needed to know about their priorities and about the role I was expected to play in our family system. "Vanessa, stop making a scene," Carol hissed, moving quickly to position herself between Rachel and me as though I was the threat that needed to be contained, rather than Rachel being the perpetrator of violence. "Everyone is staring at us. This is embarrassing." The characterization of my being assaulted as making a scene, rather than acknowledging that Rachel's violence had created the scene, was so perfectly typical of my family dynamics that I almost laughed despite the shock and pain. I was bleeding from a split lip where Rachel's slap had caught the corner of my mouth. My cheek was burning from the impact, and my parents' immediate concern was that my visible reaction to being hit was embarrassing them. "She slapped me," I said, my voice shaking with a combination of pain, shock, and growing rage. "Rachel just hit me, in an airport, in front of all these people." "Well, what did you do to provoke her?" Frank asked, his tone suggesting that Rachel's violence must have been justified by some action I had taken. "You must have said or done something to upset her. Rachel doesn't just attack people for no reason." The assertion that Rachel doesn't just attack people for no reason was contradicted by decades of evidence that Rachel attacked people, specifically me, constantly, and for reasons that ranged from trivial to completely imaginary. But Frank's need to believe that Rachel's violence was always justified by external provocation revealed his fundamental unwillingness to hold her accountable for her behavior. "I didn't do anything except stand up to get ready for boarding," I said, touching my lip and looking at the blood on my fingers. "She hit me because I wouldn't sit down when she told me to. That's it. That's the reason she committed assault at an airport gate." Several nearby passengers were clearly uncomfortable with the family conflict they were witnessing, and I could see some people pulling out phones as though preparing to record or report what they had seen. The gate agents were conferring with each other and looking in our direction, obviously aware that an incident had occurred, but not yet sure how to respond to it. "You need to apologize to your sister," Carol said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she used when issuing non-negotiable family directives. "You've upset her right before we're about to board a vacation together, and now the whole trip is going to be ruined because you two are fighting." The demand that I apologize to Rachel for being assaulted by her was so outrageously inappropriate that I wondered if I had misheard or misunderstood what Carol was saying. But her expectant expression made clear that she genuinely believed I owed Rachel an apology for the scene that Rachel's violence had created. "I'm not apologizing," I said, my voice becoming steadier as shock began transforming into clarity about what I needed to do. "Rachel hit me. She committed assault. I didn't do anything to provoke it, and I'm not going to apologize for being attacked." "Then you're being selfish and immature?" Frank said, crossing his arms in a gesture that signaled his disappointment with my failure to comply with their expectations. "Your mother is asking you to take the high road and apologize so we can all move past this and enjoy our vacation. Is your pride really more important than family harmony?" The framing of refusing to apologize for being assaulted as pride, rather than recognizing it as maintaining basic boundaries and self-respect, revealed how completely distorted my parents' perception of appropriate family dynamics had become. They genuinely believed that I should apologize to my abuser to preserve family harmony, and they saw my refusal to do so as evidence of my deficient character, rather than as Rachel's violence being unacceptable. Have you ever had a moment of absolute clarity about the fundamental dysfunction of your family relationships and the role you've been assigned to play in maintaining that dysfunction? That's exactly what I experienced standing at that gate with a bleeding lip, being told to apologize to the person who had just assaulted me, while preparing to board a vacation I had secretly funded for all of them. Rachel stood nearby looking simultaneously defiant and satisfied, clearly believing that our parents' support of her position validated her violence and proved that I had deserved to be hit. She showed no remorse for the assault, no concern about my bleeding lip, and no awareness that attacking someone at an airport gate might have consequences beyond family disapproval. "Are you going to apologize?" Carol asked again, her voice taking on the sharp edge that indicated her patience with my non-compliance was wearing thin. "We need to resolve this before boarding begins for our group." I looked at my mother, then at my father, then at Rachel, seeing clearly for the first time how the family system we had operated within for decades worked entirely to protect Rachel from accountability while demanding I absorb and accept her abuse without complaint or consequence. "No," I said simply. "I'm not apologizing. Rachel assaulted me, and I won't pretend that didn't happen, or that I somehow caused it by standing up to prepare for boarding." "Then you're going to ruin this entire vacation," Frank said, shaking his head with obvious disappointment. "We've been planning this trip for months, and you're going to make everyone miserable because you refuse to let go of a minor incident and move forward like an adult." The characterization of being slapped at an airport gate as a minor incident that I needed to let go of crystallized my understanding of what would happen if I boarded this flight. I would spend a week in Hawaii being expected to pretend Rachel hadn't assaulted me, to manage her emotions so she didn't have additional outbursts, and to accept responsibility for any conflict that occurred, because I had failed to adequately perform my role as the family member who absorbs abuse to maintain peace. As I stood there processing this reality, I heard the gate agent announce, "We're now boarding Group 3 for Flight 247 to Maui. Please have your boarding passes ready and proceed to the boarding door." Group 3 was our boarding group. My family was seconds away from boarding the flight to Hawaii, a flight I had paid $14,000 to make possible, a vacation I had worked overtime for 4 months to afford, a trip that was supposed to create positive family memories, but which would instead reinforce every toxic dynamic that had characterized our relationships for decades. I pulled out my phone and opened the airline app, accessing the reservation management page where all 4 of our tickets were listed under my confirmation code, since I had purchased them all on my credit card. The app showed our names, seat assignments, and the status of our boarding passes, along with options to modify, cancel, or change our reservations. My family was watching me check my phone, probably assuming I was looking at my boarding pass or responding to work messages, completely unaware that I was about to make a decision that would fundamentally alter our family relationships and the immediate future they believed was settled and inevitable. "Group 3, we're now boarding," the gate agent repeated, and I watched as passengers began moving toward the boarding door, forming a line that would lead down the jetway to the aircraft that would carry them to Hawaii. My family started gathering their belongings, preparing to join the boarding line, still confident that despite the assault and the conflict, we would all board together and proceed with the vacation as planned. They believed I would ultimately comply with family expectations, apologize to maintain peace, and spend the week managing Rachel's emotions while pretending everything was fine. But they were wrong about what I would do next, and their confidence in my compliance was about to be shattered by the simplest possible action I could take using the app on my phone. The decision to cancel my family's tickets wasn't impulsive or emotional, despite the dramatic circumstances in which I was making it. The clarity I felt standing at that gate with a bleeding lip, being told to apologize for being assaulted, while holding the phone that gave me complete control over the vacation I had secretly funded, was the culmination of years of accumulated awareness about family dynamics that no longer served me or reflected the person I had become. I tapped through the airline app's interface with calm precision, accessing the ticket management screen that showed all 4 reservations linked to my confirmation code. The app was designed for easy modification of travel plans, with clear buttons for various actions, including the option to cancel tickets and request refunds according to the fare rules governing our reservations. Our tickets had been purchased as non-refundable economy fares, which meant that canceling them wouldn't result in cash refunds, but would generate airline credits that could be used for future travel. The credits would be issued in the names of the original passengers, but since I was the purchaser and had used my credit card for all transactions, I would maintain control over when and how those credits could be accessed and applied. I selected Frank's ticket first, tapping the cancellation button and confirming through the subsequent screens that yes, I understood the fare rules, and yes, I wanted to proceed with canceling this reservation. The app processed the cancellation quickly, displaying a confirmation screen showing that Frank Gardner's boarding pass was no longer valid and his seat had been returned to inventory. Then I canceled Carol's ticket, following the same process and receiving the same confirmation that her reservation was now void and her boarding pass would not scan if presented at the gate. The efficiency of the cancellation process was almost startling. Within seconds, I had removed 2 passengers from a fully booked Hawaii flight minutes before boarding. Finally, I canceled Rachel's ticket, taking particular satisfaction in knowing that the person who had just assaulted me would be the one most outraged and most affected by the immediate consequences of her violence. The confirmation screen appeared, showing that all 3 of my family members' reservations were now canceled, their boarding passes invalid, and their seats reassigned to standby passengers hoping to travel to Hawaii. My own ticket remained active and valid. My boarding pass still displayed with my seat assignment, my confirmation code, and my ability to board the flight and proceed to Hawaii exactly as planned. The only difference was that I would be traveling alone, rather than with family members who had just demonstrated they valued protecting Rachel from accountability more than they valued defending me from assault. Have you ever taken an action that felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating because it represented such a fundamental break from patterns that had defined your relationships for decades? That's exactly what I experienced completing those ticket cancellations, understanding that I was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and that my family relationships would never be the same after this moment. The entire cancellation process had taken less than 2 minutes. I closed the airline app and looked up to see my family still gathering their belongings and preparing to join the boarding line, completely unaware that they no longer had valid tickets or the ability to board the flight they believed was seconds away from departure. "Come on, Vanessa," Carol said, noticing that I was standing still while they moved toward the boarding queue. "Stop sulking and get in line. We need to board before they call the next group." I didn't respond to Carol's directive. Instead, I picked up my carry-on bag, verified that my phone showed my own boarding pass still active and valid, and walked calmly toward the boarding door without waiting for my family to follow. "Vanessa," Frank called after me, his voice carrying annoyance that I was boarding without ensuring we all moved together as a group. "Wait for us. We're all boarding together." But I didn't wait or look back. I approached the gate agent, scanned my boarding pass, which displayed my seat assignment and beeped with confirmation that I was authorized to board, and walked down the jetway toward the aircraft without acknowledging my family's continued attempts to get my attention and ensure I waited for them. The jetway was empty, except for me, as most Group 3 passengers were still gathering their belongings or waiting in line behind the passengers ahead of them. I walked steadily toward the aircraft door, hearing behind me the sounds of additional passengers entering the jetway, but not turning to see if my family was among them. I reached the aircraft, was greeted by a flight attendant who checked my boarding pass and directed me to my seat in row 18, and proceeded down the aisle to locate my window seat. The overhead bins still had ample space, so I stored my carry-on bag and settled into my seat, pulling out my phone to confirm it was in airplane mode and secure for the flight. And then I waited, knowing that within minutes my family would discover that their boarding passes no longer functioned and they would be unable to board the flight they had assumed was guaranteed. The sounds of normal boarding continued around me. Passengers finding seats, storing luggage, settling in for the 5-hour flight to Maui. I maintained an outward appearance of calm while internally processing the enormity of what I had just done and anticipating the moment when gate agents would discover the situation I had created. That moment came approximately 8 minutes after I boarded, announced by sounds of agitated voices echoing from the jetway. Voices I recognized as belonging to Frank, Carol, and Rachel, clearly arguing with gate agents about their boarding pass issues and demanding immediate resolution. I couldn't hear specific words, but the tone was unmistakable. Outrage, disbelief, escalating demands for accommodation. Other passengers boarded and passed my row, while the disturbance continued at the aircraft door, some glancing back toward the commotion with curiosity or concern about whether it would delay the flight. A flight attendant moved toward the front of the aircraft to confer with gate agents about the situation, and I heard fragments of conversation. Passengers offloaded, canceled reservations, no seats available, fully booked. The terms were technical descriptions of the situation I had created. My family had been administratively removed from the flight because their tickets had been canceled after check-in, and the fully booked nature of the Hawaii flight meant there were no available seats to reassign them to, even if they somehow convinced gate agents to override the cancellations. About 3 minutes later, a gate agent entered the aircraft and made an announcement that confirmed what I had anticipated. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the slight delay. We're resolving a ticketing issue, and we'll have the door closed and be ready for pushback shortly. Thank you for your patience." The ticketing issue was my family discovering they couldn't board, and the resolution was going to be them being turned away from the gate to deal with the consequences of Rachel's violence and Frank and Carol's enabling of it. The announcement of being offloaded echoed in the aircraft as some passengers looked around with the curiosity that comes from witnessing disrupted travel plans. I sat calmly in my window seat, looking out at the airport tarmac and the Hawaii-bound aircraft, feeling not guilt or regret, but rather a profound sense of peace about having finally taken action to protect myself from people who had spent my entire life expecting me to absorb abuse without complaint or consequence. The chaos that was unfolding at the gate, my family's outrage at being unable to board, their demands for explanations, their protests about the unfairness of their situation, was entirely of their own making. They had created the circumstances that led to this outcome through Rachel's assault, Frank and Carol's defense of that assault, and their collective assumption that I would tolerate mistreatment as long as it came from family members. The cabin door closed about 8 minutes after the announcement, sealing the aircraft and finalizing the passenger manifest that included me, but excluded the family members who had just defended my being assaulted. I heard the familiar sounds of departure preparation, announcements about safety procedures, the hum of auxiliary power systems, the subtle movements of the aircraft preparing for pushback. And then we began moving backward from the gate, beginning the taxi process that would lead to takeoff and the 5-hour flight to Maui that I would spend in peaceful solitude rather than in the company of people who valued protecting my abuser over defending their daughter and sister. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, I allowed myself to fully process what had just occurred and what consequences awaited my family at the gate they had been removed from. The immediate aftermath at the gate was something I could only imagine based on my knowledge of airport procedures and my family's predictable responses to situations where they didn't get what they expected. But the texts and voicemails that would accumulate on my phone over the next several hours, which I wouldn't see until I landed in Maui and turned off airplane mode, would paint a clear picture of how the situation unfolded after I boarded. From what I would later piece together from messages and from conversations with airport staff who witnessed the events, the situation escalated quickly once Frank, Carol, and Rachel discovered they couldn't board and understood that their removal from the flight was deliberate rather than a technical error. The gate agent who first scanned their boarding passes and received invalid errors had initially assumed there was some glitch in the system, according to a message I later received. But when she checked the reservation system, she could see that all 3 passengers' tickets had been canceled approximately 10 minutes earlier through the airline's mobile app, and that the cancellations had been processed by the account holder and original purchaser, me. "These tickets have been voluntarily canceled by the purchaser," the gate agent had apparently explained to my family. "The reservations are no longer active, and the boarding passes are invalid. You won't be able to board this flight." This news, according to the messages I later received, had triggered immediate outrage and demands for intervention. Frank had insisted there must be some mistake, that the tickets couldn't simply be canceled minutes before boarding, that someone needed to fix this immediately because they had a vacation planned and luggage already checked. The gate agent had then explained, patiently at first, according to witnesses, but with growing firmness as my family's demands escalated, that the purchaser of airline tickets has the right to cancel those tickets according to the fare rules, and that the cancellations had been properly processed through the airline system. There was no error to correct, and no override that would restore their boarding privileges on a fully booked flight where their seats had already been reassigned. "This is theft!" Rachel had apparently screamed, according to multiple witness accounts. "Vanessa stole our tickets. She had no right to cancel tickets for a vacation we all planned together." This is illegal, and you need to let us board, or we're going to sue both her and the airline." The characterization of my canceling tickets I had purchased as theft revealed Rachel's fundamental misunderstanding of both property rights and airline ticket policies. The gate agent had reportedly remained calm while explaining that the person who purchases tickets has the legal right to cancel them, and that the airline would not intervene in what appeared to be a family dispute about who paid for travel arrangements. At some point during this confrontation, Carol had apparently demanded to know where I was, whether I had already boarded, and whether gate agents could remove me from the aircraft and force me to restore their tickets. The request to have me forcibly removed from a flight I was legitimately boarded on revealed my mother's assumption that authority figures would side with her family narrative rather than recognizing the legal and practical reality that I had done nothing wrong by canceling tickets I had purchased. The gate agents had explained, multiple times based on the message summaries, that I was properly boarded with a valid ticket, that they had no grounds to remove me from the aircraft, and that my family's dispute with me about who funded the vacation was not something the airline could or would adjudicate. The situation had apparently escalated to the point where airport security was called to intervene when Rachel began making threats about forcing her way onto the aircraft to confront me about the canceled tickets. Security personnel had arrived to find 3 agitated passengers blocking the gate area, preventing other passengers from boarding, and making increasingly aggressive demands for special accommodation on a flight that was now closed and preparing for departure. "You need to step away from the gate area," security had instructed my family, according to witness accounts. "The aircraft is closed, these passengers cannot board, and you're creating a disturbance that's interfering with airport operations. You can address your ticketing issues at the airline's customer service desk, but you need to leave this gate immediately." The forced removal from the gate area, physically ushered away by security personnel while other passengers watched, had been the final humiliation in a series of consequences that Frank, Carol, and Rachel had brought entirely upon themselves through their treatment of me. But I knew none of this specific detail as I sat on the aircraft taxiing toward the runway for our Hawaii departure. I only knew that I had taken action to protect myself from people who had defended assault and demanded I apologize for being attacked, and that whatever chaos was unfolding at the gate was the direct and proportional consequence of their choices. The flight to Maui was peaceful and uneventful in ways that would have been impossible if I had been traveling with my family. There were no complaints to manage, no moods to navigate, no constant vigilance required to prevent Rachel from having outbursts that would embarrass everyone. I watched movies, read a book I had been meaning to finish for months, and ate the mediocre airline meal without someone criticizing every aspect of the food, service, or experience. When the pilot announced our initial descent into Maui and the island came into view through my window, lush green mountains meeting impossibly blue ocean, I felt genuine excitement about the week ahead rather than dread about managing family dynamics. The vacation I had worked so hard to afford would still happen, but it would be a vacation I actually enjoyed, rather than an expensive obligation to spend time with people who treated me poorly. After landing, as I waited for the aircraft door to open and passengers to begin deplaning, I turned my phone off airplane mode and watched as notifications began populating my screen. Missed calls: 37 from Carol, 19 from Frank, 12 from Rachel. Text messages: 64 unread. Voicemails: 15. I didn't open any of the messages or listen to any of the voicemails. I already knew what they would say. Outrage, demands for explanations, insistence that I had overreacted, threats of consequences for leaving them at the airport, pleas to somehow reverse what I had done and restore their ability to join me in Hawaii. Instead, I deplaned, collected my checked luggage, picked up the rental car I had reserved, and drove to the beachfront resort where I had booked a single ocean view room for the week. The resort was exactly as beautiful as the photos had promised. Pristine beaches, swaying palm trees, the sound of waves creating a constant peaceful backdrop. I checked into my room, changed into a swimsuit, and walked down to the beach to watch the sunset over the Pacific Ocean. The sky transformed into brilliant oranges and pinks as the sun descended toward the horizon, and I stood in the surf, feeling the warm water lap at my ankles, while processing the events of the day and the week of peaceful solitude that stretched ahead. That evening, after returning from the beach and showering, I composed a single text message that I sent to Frank, Carol, and Rachel simultaneously. I'm in Maui. The resort is beautiful. I'll be here for the week enjoying the vacation I paid for. You're welcome to use the airline credits from the canceled tickets for your own future travel, but I won't be coordinating or funding any trips with you going forward. Please don't contact me again during my vacation or afterward. The message was clear, direct, and established boundaries that I should have set years earlier. I muted all notifications from my family's phone numbers and social media accounts, ensuring that whatever responses they sent wouldn't disturb the peace I was determined to experience during my week in Hawaii. The remainder of my vacation unfolded as a revelation of what travel could be when it wasn't burdened by family obligations or the constant work of managing other people's emotions. I snorkeled in crystal-clear waters where tropical fish swam around me in schools of brilliant colors. I took a sunrise hike to a waterfall that cascaded into a pool where I swam alone in the early morning quiet. I ate leisurely meals at restaurants without rushing to accommodate anyone else's schedule or preferences. I posted photos to social media, beautiful sunset views, snapshots of my hotel room's ocean view, pictures of meals I enjoyed at beachside restaurants. The posts were deliberate documentation of the vacation I was enjoying while my family dealt with the consequences of their choices. I didn't tag them or mention them, but I knew they could see the evidence that I was exactly where I said I would be, having the experience I had worked hard to afford, just without the people who had defended assault and then demanded I apologize for being attacked. The messages from my family continued despite my request not to be contacted, though I only saw summaries of them when I occasionally checked my phone to ensure nothing work-related required my attention. The messages evolved over the week from outrage to justification to eventual pleas for reconciliation, but they all shared the fundamental characteristic of refusing to acknowledge that Rachel's assault and Frank and Carol's enabling of it had been wrong and had warranted the consequence I imposed. Have you ever experienced the profound peace that comes from finally removing yourself from people who have spent years treating you poorly while expecting you to continuously accommodate their dysfunction? That's exactly what I felt during that week in Hawaii, understanding that the money I had spent on this trip had purchased not just a vacation, but a permanent shift in how I would allow myself to be treated by family members who had taken my generosity and tolerance for granted. On my last evening in Maui, sitting on the resort's beach watching another spectacular sunset, I received one final message from my mother that captured the essence of our family dynamic and confirmed that I had made the right decision in canceling their tickets and taking this trip alone. Vanessa, I still don't understand why you did what you did, Carol's message read. We could have worked through the situation at the airport if you had just been willing to apologize and move forward. Instead, you abandoned your family and made everyone's life more difficult. I hope you're satisfied with yourself for putting your pride above family relationships. We raised you better than this. The message, blaming me for abandoning family after they defended my being assaulted, characterizing my boundaries as pride, and suggesting I had failed to live up to their parenting by refusing to tolerate abuse, was such a perfect encapsulation of everything wrong with our family dynamics that I almost appreciated its clarity. I didn't respond to the message. Instead, I deleted it and returned my attention to the sunset, grateful for the week of peace I had experienced and determined to maintain the boundaries I had established regardless of how my family characterized my choices or blamed me for the consequences of their own behavior. 6 months after the canceled Hawaii trip, my life had settled into a new normal that was characterized by significant absence of family drama and a corresponding increase in my overall well-being and life satisfaction. The decision to cancel my family's tickets and take that vacation alone had represented not just a single boundary-setting action, but the beginning of a fundamental restructuring of how I allowed family members to treat me and what I was willing to tolerate in exchange for maintaining family relationships. The immediate financial consequence of canceling their tickets had been the generation of airline credits totaling approximately $2,250. $750 per canceled ticket times 3 tickets. The credits were issued in Frank, Carol, and Rachel's names respectively, meaning they could theoretically use those credits for future air travel if they chose to book trips on the same airline. But the credits came with several important restrictions that I had been aware of when I made the cancellation decision. First, the credits expired 1 year from the date of issue, meaning my family had a limited window to use them before they became worthless. Second, the credits could only be applied to bookings made through my airline account since I was the original purchaser, which meant my family would need to coordinate with me to actually access and utilize the credits, something I had no intention of facilitating. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the credits would only cover the base airfare on future bookings, meaning any taxes, fees, or fare differences would need to be paid out of pocket by whoever was traveling. Given that the original tickets had been purchased months in advance at relatively low prices, attempting to use the credits for new bookings would almost certainly require substantial additional payment to cover current pricing and additional costs. The practical reality was that the airline credits I had generated by canceling my family's tickets would likely expire unused, because accessing them would require coordination with me that I wasn't willing to provide, and using them would require additional financial investment that my family wasn't willing or able to make. But beyond the airline credits themselves, the financial impact of the canceled vacation extended to all the other expenses my family had presumably incurred in preparation for the trip. Time off work that Frank and Carol had arranged, and that they couldn't get back. New clothing or vacation gear they might have purchased. Arrangements they had made assuming they would be traveling, and the general opportunity cost of a week of their lives that had been allocated to a vacation that never happened. My own week in Hawaii, by contrast, had been exactly as I had planned and hoped, peaceful, rejuvenating, and completely free of the family dynamics that had made previous family vacations feel more like work than relaxation. The $14,000 total cost of the trip had been reduced to approximately $3,500 that I personally spent, my share of the original costs, which felt like a bargain for the experience I had and the boundary-setting statement I had made. The emotional and relational consequences of my actions were more complex and more significant than the financial impacts. In the immediate aftermath of the canceled trip, my family's response had been uniformly negative, ranging from Rachel's fury and threats of legal action to Frank and Carol's disappointed lectures about how I had destroyed the family and chosen pride over love, to extended family members being enlisted to contact me with messages about how concerning my behavior had been and how I needed to apologize and make things right. But I had maintained firm boundaries throughout all of these attempts at manipulation and pressure. I didn't engage with Rachel's threats, didn't respond to Frank and Carol's guilt-inducing messages, and didn't allow extended family members to mediate or negotiate on behalf of my parents and sister. I simply maintained that I had canceled tickets I had purchased after being assaulted and blamed for making a scene about being assaulted, and that I had no interest in continuing relationships with people who defended violence against me. The clarity of my position, and my unwillingness to be drawn into endless debates about whether my response had been proportional or whether I had overreacted, had eventually caused most family members to back away from their attempts to pressure me into reconciliation. The consensus that emerged among people who knew the full story seemed to be that while my canceling the tickets had been dramatic, Rachel's assault, and Frank and Carol's response to it, had been so egregious that I had been justified in taking the action I did. This shift in family perception represented a significant change from the previous pattern where Rachel's violence was normalized, and I was expected to absorb abuse without complaint. For the first time, family members were acknowledging that Rachel's behavior had been unacceptable and that expecting me to tolerate assault was unreasonable, even if they still felt uncomfortable with the dramatic way I had responded. But perhaps more important than how extended family members judged the situation was how my decision had affected my own sense of agency and self-worth. For years, I had allowed myself to be treated poorly by family members because I had internalized the belief that maintaining family relationships required tolerating bad behavior, and that setting boundaries made me selfish or unloving. The act of canceling those tickets, making a firm decision that I wouldn't spend a week with people who defended my assault, following through on that decision despite their protests, and experiencing a wonderful vacation alone that I had initially planned to share had been profoundly transformative in helping me understand that I deserved better treatment and that I had the power to demand it even from family members. Have you ever taken an action that was scary in the moment, but which ultimately taught you that you were capable of protecting yourself in ways you hadn't previously believed possible? That's exactly what I experienced through the whole Hawaii incident, learning that boundary setting wasn't cruelty, but rather self-respect, and that consequences for bad behavior weren't punishment, but rather natural outcomes of choices people made about how to treat others. 6 months after Hawaii, I had established a new relationship pattern with my family that looked very different from our previous dynamics. I maintained limited contact with Frank and Carol through occasional phone calls and text messages that were cordial but not intimate, and I declined all invitations to family gatherings where Rachel would be present. I made clear that I wouldn't attend events where I might encounter my sister, and I wouldn't participate in any family activities that required me to pretend that her assault hadn't happened or that our relationship was salvageable. Frank and Carol initially pushed back against these boundaries, suggesting that I was holding a grudge and needed to move on from the airport incident. But when I calmly restated that I wasn't holding a grudge, but rather protecting myself from someone who had physically attacked me and parents who had defended that attack, they eventually accepted that my boundaries were non-negotiable even if they didn't agree with them. Rachel herself had made several attempts to contact me directly through various channels, cycling through different approaches as different tactics failed to generate the response she wanted. Early messages were defensive and angry, accusing me of overreacting and refusing to accept responsibility for provoking her. Later messages attempted manipulation through appeals to sisterly bonds and family loyalty, suggesting that my unwillingness to reconcile was hurting our parents and damaging our family. Eventually, Rachel sent what appeared to be a genuine apology. "I'm sorry for hitting you at the airport. I was stressed about the trip and I overreacted to you standing up to get ready to board. I shouldn't have gotten physical, and I understand why you were upset. I hope we can move past this and rebuild our relationship." The apology was better than nothing, but it still minimized what had happened. I overreacted and suggested that stress justified violence. I was stressed about the trip. More importantly, the apology made no mention of the aftermath, the fact that Frank and Carol had defended the assault and demanded I apologize, which suggested Rachel still didn't understand the full scope of what had been wrong with that situation. I responded with a brief message that acknowledged her apology, but made clear that acknowledgement wasn't the same as reconciliation. "I appreciate you acknowledging that hitting me was wrong. However, the incident at the airport wasn't an isolated event, but rather part of a long pattern of you being violent toward me while our parents excused your behavior. Until that broader pattern is addressed, I'm not interested in rebuilding our relationship." That message had been sent 3 months ago, and I hadn't heard from Rachel since. I didn't know if my response had prompted any reflection or change in her behavior, and honestly, it wasn't my responsibility to ensure that she grew or improved. My responsibility was to protect myself from people who had repeatedly demonstrated that they would harm me and then blame me for being harmed. The most unexpected consequence of the Hawaii incident was how it had affected my professional life and my broader social relationships. Colleagues who learned about what had happened, through conversations where I explained why I was no longer attending family events or participating in certain activities, had been almost uniformly supportive and had shared their own stories about setting boundaries with difficult family members. I had to do something similar with my brother, one colleague told me during a lunch conversation about family dynamics. He had a pattern of borrowing money and never paying it back, and my parents kept enabling him by paying his debts and then guilting me into helping by giving him more money. I finally had to stop participating in family events where he was present and make clear that I wouldn't be his ATM anymore. It was hard, but it was necessary. These conversations with colleagues and friends who understood boundary setting and who supported my decision to protect myself from family abuse had been validating and had helped me feel less guilty about maintaining distance from Frank, Carol, and Rachel. I wasn't alone in having to make difficult choices about family relationships, and people who heard my story generally agreed that I had been justified in taking the action I did. 1 year after the Hawaii incident, I took another vacation, This time a 2-week trip to Europe that I had always wanted to take, but had never felt I could afford while funding family expenses and gatherings. The trip included 10 days in Italy exploring Rome, Florence, and the Amalfi Coast, followed by 4 days in Paris visiting museums and experiencing the culture. The total cost of the European vacation was approximately $6,000, including flights, hotels, meals, and activities. Less than half what I had spent on the canceled Hawaii family vacation, and infinitely more enjoyable because I was traveling with friends who appreciated my company, rather than family members who took my presence and generosity for granted. I posted photos throughout the trip, just as I had done in Hawaii, documenting beautiful locations, amazing meals, and memorable experiences. The posts were visible to my family through social media, and I knew they were seeing evidence that I was thriving without their presence in my life and spending money on experiences I valued, rather than on people who treated me poorly. Whether the contrast between the family vacation that never happened and the solo European adventure I was clearly enjoying had any impact on my family's understanding of consequences or their willingness to reflect on their behavior, I didn't know and didn't particularly care. My goal wasn't to teach them lessons or to change their perspective. It was simply to live my life in ways that brought me joy and surrounded me with people who treated me with respect. If you're reading this and you're dealing with family members who excuse violence, who tell you to stop making a scene when you object to being assaulted, who defend your abusers while demanding you tolerate abuse to maintain family harmony, please know that you have the right to protect yourself, even if that protection means canceling vacations you've paid for, skipping family gatherings, or maintaining distance from people who share your DNA but don't share your values. Family relationships don't entitle anyone to abuse you, and your obligation to maintain those relationships ends when the people in them demonstrate that they value protecting your abusers more than they value protecting you. Sometimes the most powerful response to being told to stop making a scene is removing yourself from the scene entirely and taking with you all the support, funding, and presence that people had been taking for granted. The vacation you fund is yours to cancel. The relationships you maintain are yours to end. The boundaries you set are yours to enforce. And the life you build after removing toxic family members is yours to enjoy, without guilt or regret. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. See you in our next story here on Her Sweet Revenge.